We end the summer with a very hard gospel. What could Jesus possibly mean by saying, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." When I was the new rector at Christ Church Accokeek in 1979, I invited Jews for Jesus to come and speak on one Sunday. I was young, I didn't know any better, I invited them. I would not recommend anybody do that today, but I was 31 years old. At the time, I was intrigued and thought that Jews who become Christians were something I should support. The congregation loved them. However, most of the Jewish Christians who spoke had been raised as Orthodox Jews, and when they converted to Jews for Jesus, their families cut them off from all contact and in many cases had funerals for them. Their families believed that in becoming a Jew for Jesus, they had turned their backs on everything the family held sacred, denied its identity, and to save itself, the family had to absolutely cut itself off from the converts. This is the situation we're reading about in Luke this morning. Becoming Christian in Luke's time was not simply joining the majority culture. No Christian in Luke's time could brag about the number of presidents who had been Episcopalians. It was adopting a way of life that was incompatible and even offensive to one's family of origin. Whatever else is true, this is not the reality you and I face today. I would argue that Christian life would be enhanced if becoming Christian meant that we became critical of the majority culture, but that is only rarely true. Christianity today is nice and fully tamed by the culture around us. From time to time, I'm asked to baptize people because it is a cultural expectation. I always refuse, even if it's family. I think that becoming a Christian, even as an infant, is a commitment to live in community. This summer, I was asked to baptize a grandniece, and having said I always refuse, there's conditions under which I will. So I said, yes, I will baptize her if you join a church where you live and meet whatever the rector of that church says you have to do to become a member. I haven't heard back from them. Today, joining the church means almost nothing to most people. Indeed, when I was in Accokeek, I did a lot of things in Accokeek. I had a seminarian who told me that when he had been a young Marine Corps officer, he became an Episcopalian because he determined that would help with his career. Luke and Jesus are talking about membership as life transforming. For most of us, it is simply a cultural expectation and increasingly an irrelevant cultural expectation. Most clergy worry about and talk about churches closing, membership declining, and our losing influence in the world around us. We are right to worry. Churches are closing. The bishops of Connecticut, Louis, could talk about this more, and I can't deny this, but for a while, there's a rumor amongst the clergy that the Diocese of Connecticut was closing one church a month. We're not doing that badly, but we're closing a lot of churches. Churches are closing, especially in New England. Membership is declining universally, even among the conservative evangelicals that you hear about. And our influence is waning. Even Catholicism is maintaining its numbers only because Hispanics are going to Catholic Church. People who look like you and me have abandoned it at the same rate that they've abandoned this church. In the time of Luke and Jesus, Christianity was seen as giving meaning to life, and it was worth risking alienation from all that one held dear just to be part of it. Unfortunately, we lost that sense of meaning in this country long ago. And can you imagine anybody kicking anybody out of Massachusetts for being a Baptist? We can look and see just how quickly meaning can be lost if we look today at Poland and Ireland. When the Poles were still behind the Iron Curtain And when the Irish were rebelling against the British, so many young men had vocations that both countries exported priests. Today, not so much. To be Catholic in Poland and Ireland at one time was a stand for meaning against power. Today, the church is seen perhaps as a relic of the past. So how do we find relevance without being persecuted? No one has figured that out successfully. Some churches grow because they have charismatic leadership that draws people in. This is dangerous because if the leadership fails or moves on, the congregation dies. Just look at St. Paul's in Darien. It used to be the largest church in the Diocese of Connecticut. Tiny now. Some churches grow because of programs they offer. I was joking after 8 o'clock that when I used to have to lead youth groups, we told people that you need to come to church and get pizza every Sunday night. And if you attended 5 times in a row, you got to go on a skiing trip. We were careful not to talk about Christianity because that might alienate them. Recent studies have said that the only 2 things which can be counted on to keep a church alive are great and consistent preaching, and with that preaching attracting people who are already churchgoers moving to the community. Good preaching and people who move here who already have the habit. Recent studies have confirmed that our chances of converting those who have never gone to church are infinitesimal. Now, I'm sure that everybody who has started coming just out of the blue will speak to me today and say that's not true, but statistically it is true that we are successful when we appeal to people who are already in the habit and we distinguish ourselves by the quality of the preaching. Of course, we need to continue doing outreach to people who don't come because it is important. We gain some membership, but statistically it's tiny. Having said all that, there are times the clergy ought always to preach conversion sermons. We classify those who attend rarely in a number of ways, a couple of which you may have heard of and one of which you have probably not. You've all heard of C&E Christians, right? They're the reason we need folding chairs on Christmas Eve and maybe on Easter, Christmas and Easter Christians. Every Christian Christmas and Easter sermon you hear should be a conversion sermon. You won't mind, and the people who only come here for C&E might decide they need to come back more often. Then there is a smaller group of people that are the Ashes and Palm Christians. I'm not sure you've heard of Ashes and Palm Christians, but they are people who only show up on Ash Wednesday and Palm Sunday, generally people who are a little more penitent than maybe the rest of us, and they like getting something a little extra. Every Ash Wednesday and Palm Sunday sermon should be a sermon on conversion. You won't mind, and they might decide there is more here than they thought. Then the last group I want to talk about is a group you may not have heard of. People after 8 o'clock were intrigued by this group. I mean no disrespect. Well, I mean a little bit of disrespect. But there are also the hatch, match, and dispatch Christians. Hatch, match, and dispatch. Baptism, marriage, and funeral. Every baptism, wedding, and funeral should be a conversion sermon. We have people when we do, you can look at the parking lot on a day when there's a baptism. Can't get in. A lot of people are here. They're not sure why. Somebody's being baptized. Perfect opportunity to try and get some of them to say, I'll come back. Weddings. Shouldn't be about how wonderful the couple is. Should be about conversion. And I've had people join churches based on having been to a wedding. Funerals should not be, especially when you're marrying somebody you don't know, it's always dangerous to speak about that person. As I may have told you the previous time, my first funeral was for somebody I'd never met in Accokeek. And I called him by his first name, which absolutely no one had ever called him by in his entire life. So one of the guidelines to be sure whatever you're saying is relevant to the person who died. But moreover, you have people in church who feel like they need to be here, but don't see a reason to be here the rest of the year. Conversion sermon. So C&E, Ashes and Palm, and Hatch, Match, and Dispatch are times when we should especially be thinking about preaching conversion. As we're in this transition, we need to understand that preaching is crucial. And we need, therefore, as I've said before, to be certain that we give whomever we call the space to take time to write a good and compelling sermon so that you and I will have a reason to go to church, and especially to this church. Again, when I was in my second year in Akakik, 1980, 1981, a parishioner came to me. She and her husband had been a member of the church next door where I'd done my field work when I was a seminarian in Virginia. And they liked my preaching, and so they came over. They felt like the preaching at St. John's was, So they came over to Christ Church and joined, as did a few other families. I was very flattered by that. After listening to me for a year, she called up and said she wanted an appointment to talk to me. So I thought, well, I know what this is about. Her husband was an outrageous drunk. I think she wants to talk to me about her husband. And I also knew that her daughter and she, her grown daughter and she, were estranged, didn't talk even once a year. So I'm sure she wanted some pastoral counseling. So I put on whatever few pastoral counseling skills I have and sat down ready to talk to her. And instead she said, and I can still see her to this day, she said, my husband doesn't respect me. My garden club doesn't respect me. My bridge club doesn't respect me. The women I play golf with don't respect me. And the way you preach, you don't respect me either. That when you were a seminarian, you prepared your sermon, they were carefully delivered, and we moved here because of that. She said, whatever you're doing now, it does not speak to me at all. Well, what I was doing now, in 1981, was a reflection. When I was at Princeton after Virginia, the rector of the church, Worley Schwartzentruber, had been raised as a Canadian Mennonite missionary in Argentina. And he believed that sermons were crucial. Unfortunately, he believed they should also be an hour long. And so the family service, he would cut them back to 40 minutes. And the parishioners were saying, you know, our children just can't sit still for all this, Father Schwartzentruber. It's all wonderful. So he said, would you preach at the family service every Sunday? And I said, look, I'm a graduate student. I've got a family. I really don't have time to write a sermon. And they said, just say whatever comes to mind. So I would, before I left the house, I would look up the lessons, and then while I was driving to church, I would think about them, and then I said whatever comes to mind. You know, well, I was teaching fellow, so the Bible was not any real challenge for me at that. I thought at that it's more of a challenge now. And I would say whatever comes to mind, and they loved it. So when I went to Akakik, I thought, oh, you know, I've got this preaching thing down pat. So I would wake up at 5 in the morning, look at the lessons, decide which one of them I knew the most about, write some notes down on a 3x5 card, and walk up and down the aisle. And I would say, you know, I would say, hi, Andrea, and talk to you, and then I would talk to Ralph, and I'd talk to people, and they were very engaged, and it was very entertaining. I was sort of a comic priest. And people absolutely loved it. But I said nothing serious. You know, sometimes it was okay, sometimes it was horrible. Occasionally people found it moving and wonderful because I touched on some pastoral issue. But I wasn't preaching the gospel. So this woman came to me and she said, you know, you're not taking me seriously. Best thing that ever happened to me. From that day to this, and I hope into the future, I have written out every sermon I've ever preached. I go off it a lot, but I've written it out. Because that's the only way we can be sure we're taking the gospel seriously. To take the gospel seriously can occasionally, I could have fun with this lesson, occasionally means saying things that you really don't want to hear, but might need to hear. Because the gospel has some critical things to say about the way we live. She and her husband stayed in the church. I became a better priest and preacher. The congregation grew. Whatever you think of what I do in the pulpit, the point is that for most Christians, preaching is central to the reason we come here week after week. We don't come here to be entertained. We might enjoy a funny priest who knows all of our names, but we don't come for that reason. Might make it easier to endure when you're here, but it's not the reason we come. I hope that we will call someone who, whatever talents she or he has, will see preaching as the most important thing to do with you and me. Furthermore, I hope she or he will see the sermon as the opening of a conversation. We need to call someone with a thick skin. When I was a priest in Akakeek and later in Weston, I would have a group of 10 to 15 people that met with me monthly to talk about how my sermons had been and the other work of the church. Not the vestry, just people who were engaged and were there weekly. What they said was not always kind, but it was always helpful. And I think we need to nurture that kind of conversation so that the preacher knows what is happening. You know, I said the same thing at 8 o'clock, and I said the worst thing to tell me is I really like how you sounded. Well, what's that mean? My voice worked today? It just means, you know, we're looking for a content thing, even if it's not what we want to hear. But you have to get a priest with a thick skin. If you get one who starts crying or won't talk to you again, that's not any good. And I hope that whomever we call will see the C&E Christians, the Ash and Palm Christians, and the Hatch, Match, and Dispatch Christian opportunities as times to preach conversion. These are people who are already thinking about coming. We need to get them to come. Modern sermons are not meant to be pronouncements, but are invitations to dialogue. You should be unafraid to tell the preacher what you like and don't like, and how it was important to you or utterly trivial or someplace in between. Becoming a Christian is no longer a question of hating our family because we are turning our backs on them as it was in the first century or if it was with that group from Jews for Jesus. But it is a question of finding a place in our week when the society we are so much a part of is questioned, examined, and has faith applied to it. In some ways, being Christian is hating the majority culture. It is taking up a cross which stands for values at odds with what success is deemed to be in our world. It is finding meaning in things much different from material success, career advancement, and financial security. We need good preaching to remind us of this because the world is very seductive. We must be reminded that we find Christ and meaning in caring for the least among us and not in anything else.